Saloni, that wasn't fair at all. You took half the work that I did. That you yeah. But thank you so much, Saloni, and it's really wonderful to be back here at the Print. Really small and intimate audience. But ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say that this is going to be an evening that you won't forget, because you have Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary, and everything that Saloni said is true. He has served in China twice, once as a young diplomat, once as an older one. He served elsewhere, of course, in parts of India's neighborhood in Nepal, elsewhere in Indonesia. And this is a book that he's written. I'm not sure if any of you have seen it. It's called How China Sees India and the World. The slug is the authoritative account of the India-China relationship. And if you, I'm not sure if the book is available here to buy, but you should really Google it and get a copy if you haven't, and I'm sure there will be something on Kindle. But the reason I say this is a highly readable book is because Ambassador Shyam Saran has not just written this from this perspective of a diplomat who writes sort of turgid prose, but from a reader's point of view. Even those of you who live in Gurgaon would like it, I promise. So, okay. No, that was a joke. So let me start by taking up from where Saloni left off. China, India's most important neighbor, right? I mean, you brush up on China every day. I'm sure the tiles in this room are from China. Definitely the camera tripod, I'm sure the camera, the glass, the mirrors on the wall, the lampshades, the light fittings, it's all from China. The toothbrush that you use every morning, I mean, I could go on. You brush up against China all day, all the 24 hours of the day. It's not made in India as much as it continues to be made in China. Saloni said $75 billion of two-way trade. It's actually crossed $100 billion, and that too during COVID. And also, if you obviously all of you know this, that about 2 years ago in April of 21, the Chinese sort of climbed the heights in Ladakh, in eastern Ladakh, and there have been 17 rounds of talks between the Indians and Chinese that they should come down those heights and go back to beyond the line of actual control, which is the border between India and China. They say they have, we are not really sure. Actually, nobody really knows whether they have or they haven't. Some say they have, some say they haven't. But in this COVID period, when India was struggling with COVID, India's trade with China went up and crossed $100 billion. It's so strange, but look at what's happening inside China today with their COVID, and you hear that there are more than 60,000 deaths, but that's another story. So this book called How China Sees India, and if any of you are interested, it's truly a must-read. So I'm going to ask Ambassador Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary, about why he wrote this book, and how does China see India? Because there was this poll quite recently which said that the Chinese perception of India was also very negative, just like the Indian perception of India. So sir, tell us, why is it that the Chinese... okay, first, how does China see India?
Thank you very much, Jyoti, for your very generous introduction. I would like to thank Quorum and Saloni for arranging this evening. I hope that it will be an evening that would be worthwhile for all of you. So why did I write this book, and how does China see India? The reason why I wrote this book is that even though in more recent times both India and China are in a sense neighbors, frankly, both India and China have very stereotyped images of each other. And those stereotype images come from the fact that essentially India and China are strangers to one another. That sounds rather strange because, if you are looking at a longer span of history, then from about the 1st century AD to about 1000 AD, actually there was a considerable amount of interaction taking place between India and China. Buddhism went to China from India, went to China through essentially 3 routes. One was the caravan routes through Central Asia, because India and China were deeply connected with one another through this route, and much of Buddhism went through the land route. So if you go today, what is being called the Silk Road, you will find that along that route there are ruins of many, many Buddhist monasteries. And these were all essentially Indian monks or Central Asian monks who used to run these monasteries, but those monasteries also used to serve what later the Islam took over as caravansarais. Actually, the first caravansarais in Central Asia were actually what were taken over from the Buddhist monasteries. So there was this Central Asian route. Then you had the very, very flourishing trade route through the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. So the Malabar coast of India, the Coromandel coast of India were connected through Southeast Asia to the eastern coast of China. And there used to be a lot of trade taking place along this route. And there were Indian traders who were actually living in some of the trading ports of China, like what is now Guangzhou or Canton, or there was a place called Xuanzhou. There is still ruins of an old Buddhist temple. There are Tamil inscriptions because there were Tamil traders who were traveling to China. So there was a period of great engagement between the two sides. And Buddhism became very much part and parcel of a popular religion in China. So there was this period where at one point, there were something like 3,000 Indian monks who were living in various monasteries in China, essentially translating Buddhist texts into Chinese so that the Chinese could understand.
So what period is this? What period is this?
I'm talking about the 1st century AD to about 1000 AD. Now, what happened after 1000 AD is that, one, Buddhism in this land of birth itself became very weak. There was the Hindu Reformation under Shankaracharya. Buddhism, in its land of birth, became a has-been kind of religion. So the kind of, inspiration that China and other places were getting from India in the Buddhist faith, that diminished over a period of time. Second was because of the Islamic invasions of India. Much of these routes which were connecting India and China, they were also interrupted. So literally from 1000 AD onwards, the engagement between India and China became less and less over a period of time. What continued was the maritime trade. Malabar coast and the Coromandel coast continued to trade with China, but the kind of more deeper engagement which was there during the first 1000 years, that over a period of time then diminished. So by the time you come to, say, the 18th century, there is some notion about India in Chinese mind because it is the origin of the Buddhist faith, which the Chinese are still Buddhists, but not much of a direct contact. So the contact then, which takes place after something like 700 to 800 years, is with a very different India, an India which is under colonial rule. It is under the British. And how does China come into contact with India again and Indians again? Because the British Empire in India is using Indian soldiers, using Indian policemen for their opium wars in China, for the control of the concessions in Shanghai and other coastal towns. So when the Chinese are
once again encountering India, they are encountering India in a very different sense. It's not the India, the land of Buddha and the knowledge capital of the world, where Chinese monks were coming to Nalanda or Vikramshila and studying Buddhism or other sciences. This is a very different India. This is like what they call a slave India. And when China's own kind of revolutionary movement starts, India is called actually a teacher by negative example. This is not what China should become. Look at what has happened to a great ancient civilization. It has become a slave nation. This is not the fate that China should have. So this is where, the negativity that we are talking about, this is where the negativity starts coming. By the way, it is not entirely negative, because this is also a period where there is an independence movement beginning in India,
right,
against British colonialism. The Chinese are also, being dominated by Western imperialism. So they are also looking for answers, how to deal with this Western imperial challenge. So there is a certain empathy between the two sides, because they are faced with the same kind of.
So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the Opium Wars, and this century of humiliation, this phrase within quotes that the Chinese talk about all the time. And now finally when they are liberated in 1949. So the second Opium War is also 1857, which is India's first war of independence. So tell us a little bit about what's happening in China in this period.
So China is a very strong, great empire, which is the Qing Empire. This is the Manchu Empire. By the way, it is not a Han Chinese empire. It is an alien empire in that sense. For more than 200 years, China has been under alien rule. The rule by the Manchus. That is the Qing Empire. But this is a period where the Qing Empire, having been in power for nearly 200 years, is now in its sort of weaker phase. It is facing all kinds of peasant revolts. It is facing economic distress. There is an anti-Manchu kind of movement amongst the Han Chinese, who are talking about how they should rise up against the alien rulers. So this is a time where the Qing Empire is weakening, but this is also the time when the British, the Americans, the French, the Japanese, they are beginning to encroach into this whole area, which was so far dominated by the Chinese, and to some extent earlier was dominated by the Mughals in India. So when you have this kind of penetration taking place by the Western powers, who have superior technology, who have superior weapons, which the Qing Empire, though it is very strong, it is very rich, it is no match for the new technology which the West is able to deploy. So there is a constant pressure on the Qing Empire to open up the country for trade. That is, to bring in Western goods, to buy Chinese goods. And what has happened is that the British become addicted to tea. And China is the biggest source of tea. Now, the British do not have anything to sell in that particular period, don't have much to sell to the Chinese. So actually there is a huge amount of silver which is flowing out of Britain to China. And so the British are looking desperately as to what they can do in order to have a more balanced kind of trade. And that is when they start exporting opium to China. There is already, it's
Where's
not...
the opium coming from?
Coming from India, first from the Bengal area, Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, that particular area. Then you have later on from the Malwa region, from the western part of India. So the export of opium to China becomes the big, sort of way of trying to, balance the trade. Now, in small quantities, this was already part and parcel of Chinese society, taking a little bit of opium. But, when this huge amount of opium starts coming into China, then there is a massive problem for addiction. Then the emperor says, ban the import of opium. And there is a Chinese governor of Guangzhou, the port, who actually, dumps a lot of the opium crates into the sea. And that is when, the British then attack, forcing China to reverse the prohibition against the import of opium. So the first war takes place in 1842, and the second war, as you said, takes place a few years later. And it is during these two wars that the British are essentially bringing in, Indian soldiers as part and parcel of their armed assault against China. And as a consequence of this also, what happens is that there are not only British opium traders, but there are Indian opium traders as well, who make a lot of money out of this opium trade. So, the philanthropy with which Gigi Boy is associated with, the JJ School of Arts, for example, in Mumbai, actually, it is through the opium trade, the wealth generated by the opium trade, that Mumbai emerges as a great port city and the home of many, many, very rich traders who essentially have made their money from the opium trade. And the same families, Sassoon family, for example, or a branch of the Tata family, for example, they then set up these massive hotels, built huge mansions for themselves in, for example, Shanghai. So they were apart from the French traders and the British, they were the very, very big, rich people who owned a tremendous amount of property in Shanghai. So it is this particular history, that there were these Indians who were piggybacking on British imperialism, exploiting China, oppressing China, and this then fed into the sort of modern sentiment about India, that these were, people who were a slave nation, and yet they were like proxies for the British. They were also exploiting.
So this
China.
modern perception of India on the part of the Chinese, this negative perception remains?
Oh, yes, very much so. I mean, it is a residue of that. But as I said, I mean, I don't want to leave the impression that this is all that you have in terms of Chinese perception. Because as I mentioned, there was a certain kind of empathy, a certain kind of feeling of being on the same side, because both countries were actually battling Western imperialism. And also culturally, because you don't forget that this was a huge cultural challenge as well. For these two very ancient, long-standing civilizations, Asian civilizations. For them, coming face to face with Western technology, Western power, this was something which was a completely new experience. So there was, if you see the writings during that time, there were, Chinese intellectuals, Chinese scholars who were also talking about how, India and China as the two great civilizations, they need to work together to really bring about the rejuvenation of Asia again. Something that Nehru picked up afterwards in the Asian Relations Conference after India became independent in 1947. Or when, for example, Rabindranath Tagore went to China in 1924, 1925, that particular period. That was also a period where there was that sense of, empathy between the two sides. But if you want to know what was the dominant perception, the dominant perception was a negative perception.
So, if any of you have been to Kerala, have any of you here been to Kerala, to Kozhikode, which is Calicut, and you see the Chinese fishing nets, right? Now, tell us, how did those fishing nets, and why are they called Chinese fishing nets? I mean, this maritime trade that you alluded to earlier, and of course you have the terrestrial trade, which is the Silk routes, but tell us a little bit about the maritime trade that connects China with India.
So, as I mentioned, that even though they may have lost contact with each other during the period after the first millennium, the maritime trade continued. So you had, like for example, Broach, Surat on the western coast. You had what is now Cochin. You had on the Malabar side, you had ports which also Masulipattam, for example. All these were ports which were really, in a sense, the entrepôt ports, essentially for one, textiles, and two, spices. So even today in Cochin, you will find that it's a huge, spice market. So what used to happen was that a lot of the spices from Southeast Asia used to come to the Malabar and the Coromandel coast, from where then it would then be re-exported to various other parts of the world, including the Gulf, to Mediterranean. The Chinese also used to come in order to buy spices, but also to buy other things. For example, they used to buy a lot of Indian cotton textiles. The Chinese were very good at silk textiles, but India was the cotton king in a sense. And for many, many years, cotton textiles from India were actually the currency of trade in this region. So if you go today, for example, to Indonesia, you will find still 500-year-old patolas, for example, from Gujarat, still in family heirlooms. Or you had kalamkari from Andhra, which you would find, say, in a place like Bali, where, like in Andhra, the kalamkari used to be used as a backdrop for the recitations of the Ramayana or Mahabharata in Bali, for example. So textiles were really, the Indian textiles were very, very sought after in Southeast Asia, but also in China. So there used to be a lot of, the trading that used to go on. It used to be in the hands of the Arabs. It used to be in the hands of the Indians. They also used to be in the hands of some of the Chinese traders. So, for example, Quilon, Quilon and Surat had become, during the period of, say, the 14th century, 15th century, actually bases for Chinese merchant fleets to come. They would come from China, restock here in India, and then go to other places. So there was this very flourishing maritime trade which was taking place. And it is this which was encroached upon by the Portuguese, then came the Dutch, then came the British. They basically, before the Industrial Revolution, these countries were essentially muscling into the textile trade. So the first factories which were set up in Calcutta or on Chennai, in Madras, these factories were essentially for gathering together textiles for export to other countries in the region.
So how does China become, how does it begin to believe that it's at the center of the universe? This whole Middle Kingdom complex, right? Where it believes that it's at the center of the universe, and that other kingdoms or other countries should pay tribute to it, that India is on the periphery. When does this happen? And this phrase that you have in your book, which is the mandate of heaven and all things under heaven. So talk to us a little bit about this.
So, Chinese civilization, Chinese culture really developed along the river valleys of the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. That is the heartland of China. That is where Chinese culture and civilization began. Now, throughout history, if you look at Chinese history, what has happened? What has happened is that you have this settled population, very fertile area because of the rivers, becoming very rich. So you have the earliest kingdoms, which are very, in a sense, feudal kingdoms, but they are very rich. And they are on the periphery, Chinese periphery, if you get away from, these river valleys, what do you have? You have the steppes. You have the grasslands, Mongolia, for example, or what is now, Central Asia, or Tibet. So all along the periphery of China, you had these steppe tribes who were constantly attracted by the wealth of the heartland, Chinese heartland, and there were constant assaults and attacks against this heartland. And as I mentioned to you, sometimes they would even conquer the heartland and become part and parcel of the stream of Chinese empires, like the Qing dynasty itself, as I mentioned to you. The last big dynasty was not a Han dynasty, it was an alien dynasty. So there used to be this constant assault, constant pressure on China from these, peripheral tribes, which is why the Great Wall came up. Why was the Great Wall made? The Great Wall was made to keep the marauding tribes away from the heartland. So there was this sense which developed over a period of time that here was a very highly cultured and civilized center with a periphery of very barbaric, very aggressive tribes. And you began to think of yourself as the civilized center with a periphery of less civilized, more aggressive, kingdoms and tribes around China. So there was this sense of we are the middle kingdom, surrounded by less civilized, concentric circles of other countries. So the more you moved away from the center, the less and less civilized people you found. I mean, that was in the mandala which the Chinese had, that was the mandala. That we are the center of the world and we are surrounded by, all these lesser people around us. So that is very much part and parcel of the historical experience. Unlike India, which was, yes, subject to invasions, migrations, trade, but it always found itself at the crossroads. Whether it is of the caravan routes or of the maritime routes that we talked about. So we became, over a period of time, a very highly diverse, very highly plural kind of a society. And in a sense, also a bit of a cosmopolitan society, that you were at ease, in a sense, with a
So the Chinese
encounter.
were not at ease?
No, the Chinese even today think of themselves as a stable center, but the world around us is very hostile. That notion has not gone. That somehow or the other we have to keep the rest of the world at bay. Because it's a dangerous world out there. So this notion has come from this being the Middle Kingdom. And also, don't forget that during this particular period, China was, without doubt, the richest country in the region. So if you look at the kingdoms around China, you had Japan, you had Korea, you had Southeast Asia. None of them, even though they were very prosperous, none of them were actually equal to the kind of power and wealth of China. And those who wanted to do trade with China had to, in a sense, acknowledge the power and the glory of the Chinese empire. So again, over a period of time, that notion came that we are a superior country and the rest around us are smaller countries and they need to offer deference to us as the great power. Now, the world today has changed. It is no longer that China is surrounded by only smaller countries. I mean, there is a cluster of major powers, even in Asia. I mean, India too is a rising power. So adjusting to that notion has become very difficult because China, I have argued in the book, looks at power in a very hierarchical sense. So what does that mean? That means the Chinese notion traditionally of harmony. How do you ensure harmony? in society or in terms of foreign relations, hierarchy must be maintained. In the state you have the emperor, then you have various people at different levels. Similarly, in the family, you have the head of the family and others, defer to the head of the family. So it is a similar kind of a thought process that if you want peace and you want harmony amongst nations, then there must be some notion of hierarchy. So if you have...
So India must be part of that hierarchy.
Yes, today it is that, the Asian order, in terms of hierarchy, must be led by China because China is the most powerful country. And others should therefore defer to China. If you do not defer to China, then you must be, put in your place. So everybody has a certain place in the ranking order, and you should not try to be more than what you are. So there is this constant sense of trying to tell India, you do not seem to know your place. You are getting too big for your boots. You should recognize that we are much larger than you, and you should know your proper place. So that is because of that sense of hierarchy.
So today is the conflict. I mean, there hasn't been a face-off in Ladakh, unlike 2 years ago when we had the face-off in the Galwan Valley and India lost 20 soldiers and the Chinese allegedly lost 4. So is that what it's all about? Is that there is no border that both sides agree upon, and therefore the Chinese will cross the line of actual control and come into India in this case and basically do what they want to do?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that, because don't forget that at least since 1987-88, after Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China, which was a very big event, considering that we had fought a war in 1962. Essentially, from that period onwards until recently, even though there was a disputed border, both India and China had agreed that, we will maintain some sense of peace and tranquility at the border while we get on with increasing our trade relations, people-to-people exchanges, cultural relations. The fact that we have a border dispute should not preclude our being able to develop other relations. Secondly, since India and China are the two largest emerging economies in the world, Asia is coming into its own because of the emergence of both India and China. So there was this sense that India and China working together could actually influence the shape of the world to come. So adjusting, for example, the international trading regime, the WTO regime, or the negotiations, for example, on climate change, where we were, in a sense, on the same side of the fence, and many other issues. That India and China working together could actually bring about a much more equitable regime for themselves than if they were not working together. Because of that sense, both sides had an interest in keeping the border as quiet as possible, and even as recently as about 4 years ago, when I had gone to Beijing, there was a Chinese vice foreign minister who was actually telling this international audience that look at India and China. We are the mature countries. We have a problem with the border, and yet we have been able to maintain for the last 30, 40 years, a very, very positive relationship. The border has been very quiet. And this is actually a model for other countries to follow.
What changed under Xi Jinping?
Yeah, so what changed under, I don't think it is essentially about Xi Jinping so much, but I think what you need to recognize is that China looks at this relationship very much from the point of view of what the global or the geopolitical sort of setting is. So in that geopolitical setting, if you take, for example, the global financial and economic crisis of 2007-2008 as an important turning point, this is where China emerges out of this with its growth rate at 6% or 7% per annum, making it a bigger and bigger economy, to become the second largest economy of the world. You have the crisis hitting the very center of the capitalist world, that is the United States of America, then spreading to Western Europe. And so what you find is that while China has recovered and is still growing fast, you have both US and Western Europe whose economies are more or less stagnant. They have not recovered. Even today you can say perhaps they have not fully recovered. So the power gap between the US and China, if they are the two largest, most powerful countries, that has become to shrink. China is catching up with the United States. What about India? If you take, say, 2001, 2002, 2003 as a benchmark, you have India, which is still behind China. But India is growing at a much faster rate. So if you go back to, say, 2004, 2005, if you look at the newspapers at that time, if you look at, the kind of comments you have, India is going to be the next China. India is growing at the rate of 9% per annum, some in a few years even 10% per annum. So yes, India is behind China, but it is catching up very fast. No? So there the Chinese sense is we are weak vis-a-vis the US, and here is India which is catching up with us. Therefore, it makes sense for India and China to work together. India is not far behind, and it's probably going to become even more important going forward. After all, this is the period where you got the nuclear deal.
Right.
So their sense is, why are the Americans paying so much attention to the Indians? Obviously, they think that India is going to become a major power in the near future, and therefore, they want to be on the side of India. If they want to be on the side of India, then China should make some moves in order to prevent India from becoming too close to US. So our diplomatic space had expanded. What has happened after the economic and financial crisis is that these trends get reversed. That the gap between the US and China starts shrinking in China's favor, and the gap between India and China starts expanding again. That period is gone. So in the new context, if we were having, these peace and tranquility agreements at the border, if earlier there were encounters between Indian patrols and Chinese patrols, both sides had an interest not to let that escalate. Now perhaps the Chinese view is, we are so much more powerful. Why the hell should we,
let India...
I mean, if the Indians are, coming and from our point of view, entering areas that they should not, then they need to be put in their place, as I mentioned. So also don't forget that the infrastructure development on our side has been much poorer than what has been going on the Chinese side. But we started catching up. From about 2003, 2004, we started building up our own infrastructure. So when we started building up our infrastructure, what happened? Areas which we were going to say once in 2 weeks or once in 3 weeks, now you were able to go there much, much more frequently. So many more frequent patrols were being mounted, both by the Indian side as well as by the Chinese side. So it should come as no surprise that the encounters between the patrols was becoming also very much more frequent. So the Chinese, from their point of view, places where they never saw Indian patrols before, suddenly they find that the Indians are coming into areas which they never came in before. Now we say it is our territory, so we should be able to go to these places. So in the changed frame of mind that we are a more powerful country, why should we tolerate, these more frequent, what we see as the Indians coming into these areas? Perhaps we need to put a stop to it.
So I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions on this, on the border conflict, but before I open it to the House, I do want to ask you about the Dalai Lama and India's relationship with Tibet. Now, since His Holiness the Dalai Lama fled Tibet in 1959, he's lived in India. He's perhaps the world's most famous refugee in a sense. But what does that do to the India-China relationship?
So, this even goes back to the origin of the 1962 war between if you take the period, say, from 1956 onwards, there were some skirmishes taking place on the India-China border. Because the Chinese were trying to improve their border management, we were trying to improve our border management. So this was the first time that Indian and Chinese patrols were actually coming face to face with each other. But by both the Chinese as well as the Indians, these were regarded as minor skirmishes which were taking place. They were not given much importance. And even if you see Chinese archives which are now open, you see that the Chinese leaders are not very worried about what was happening at the border. They said, we should not fire, we should not engage in any kind of, violent clashes. If the Indians are coming in, we should also try and go to the other side and set up our posts, but don't get into a violent confrontation. Now, this view of minor incidents at the border began to change after the Tibet revolt of 1959 and the Dalai Lama seeking shelter in India, and India agreeing to give shelter not only to the Dalai Lama, but very large number of Tibetan refugees who came into India. Now, they became, as a result of the revolt, became very, very nervous, because it was as if their whole control over Tibet was being challenged, And despite the fact that they had armed occupation of Tibet, they had not been able to prevent the revolt. And after this revolt in 1959, actually there were incidents all over Tibet. So justifiably, they were very, very nervous about their position in Tibet and believed that they were under assault not only from India, but from Western powers as well, who was trying to take advantage of this. So the border skirmishes, which they were earlier not paying much attention to, you start seeing statements being made that these skirmishes are actually designed to weaken China's position in Tibet and trying to, in fact, challenge China's position in Tibet. So what were minor skirmishes became almost like strategic threat to China. And the fact that there was also the US CIA, which was trying to, take advantage of the revolt, financing some of the rebels in Tibet. In their mind, it became that the Indians are working together with the United States in order to undermine China. So the whole perception, whole prism through which they were looking at these border incidents began to change. So in 62, they were really reacting to both a sense of great, feeling of threat and nervousness, as also the fact that, they felt that this was a low-cost, low-risk operation against India, because they were quite convinced that India was not in a position to really hit back, and which is true, because we never thought that the Chinese would actually engage in a large-scale military operation against India. If you look at Mr. Nehru's statements, he said there will never be a war between India. I mean, these are skirmishes.
So was he misguided?
Place.
Was Nehru
Yes.
misguided?
He was misguided because he did not understand that the shelter given to Dalai Lama and the Tibetan refugees coming to India, while I think it would be impossible for a democratic country like India to turn around and say, no, we will not give shelter to him. Nehru felt that his relationship with Chou En-lai was strong enough for him to be able to explain to Chou En-lai that in fact it was better for China that Dalai Lama was India rather than in say some Western country. He misjudged what the reaction from the Chinese would be. Secondly, he did not, and nobody in India was looking at what was happening inside China. Because this was the period from 1959, as you know, to 1962, there was the Great Leap Forward, which turned out to be a complete disaster. There was a huge famine in China. Something like 30 million Chinese died in that famine. There was a a rather difficult position because the Sino-Soviet relations, the relations with Moscow were deteriorating. The United States of America was putting pressure on China, particularly on the Taiwan crisis. So generally the situation seemed to be, from our point of view, that China could not, in fact, think in terms of any kind of a military operation. What they did not understand was that there was a certain political turmoil, internal political turmoil taking place. Because of Mao's decisions to go for the Great Leap Forward and all the disasters which followed, he was essentially pushed to what was known as the second line of leadership.
Right.
And the pragmatists, became the more dominant. So Mao started looking for ways in which he could get back to be the dominant leader. And this is the period when he started then strengthening his relationship with those factions in the PLA, in the People's Liberation Army, who could help him get back to number one position. And so the India-China conflict actually came in as part and parcel of that internal turmoil which was taking place. So the final decision actually to go to war with India was taken by Mao himself. When there was opposition in the Politburo from some of the other key leaders, and they cited all these various reasons why they should not go to war with India, it is he who said, no, we will go to war and we'll teach India a lesson.
Well, fascinating stuff, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure you'll agree, but I'm going to open it up to the House. So any questions? Please go ahead. Do you want to say?
Stand up,
Okay. Sure, of course.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I'm very curious, what are the various scenarios the India-China relationship could evolve into in the years to come?
Do you want to just say who you are and so just
My name is Rohit.
what do you do?
Well, I'm listening to you right now.
Okay, Rohit, listening to Ambassador.
Any other question? Maybe we can take two or
Do you
three
want to take
together.
a couple more questions, perhaps? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
My name is Anu, and do you think it was a right decision for China to support Russia in war against Ukraine? And is there any regret in China for the initial position that they took?
Okay. Anyone else? We'll take, go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Prashant, I'm a lawyer. I have a...
In Gurgaon?
Yeah. But I have a slightly more policy-oriented question. So you must be aware that we have like a semi-complete blockade on any sort of investment coming from China. You need central government approval for any foreign investment that comes in from China. Do you think that's a way of dealing economically with China, or should we have something like a US-based approach? So you keep the door open, but then you keep tinkering on with whatever sort of deals happen. Every once in a while you see a proper threat coming.
Well, to answer the last question first, I mean, she began with, I think Saloni began with saying how despite, the tensions between the two sides, our trade has actually been going up. It's more than $100 billion. And therefore, despite whatever we may be saying that it can't be business as usual, it seems to be more than business than usual. So that is one aspect. Second, to also talk about the investment, you might have seen the report about a couple of days ago that as part of the deal for Apple to open major manufacturing facility in India, they say that you do not have industries which can supply us the components that we need to make iPhones or iPads in India. Therefore, you must give permission to 14 Chinese companies to set up manufacturing facilities here in India so that they can feed into this large Apple. And the Indian government has agreed.
Has agreed?
Yes. So there is a certain sort of inconsistency in a sense to what the policy is with regard to Chinese investment. And the reason is very simple. It is not only India facing that issue. It is a problem being faced even by the United States, which says we want to decouple. they may be able to decouple with respect to some very high technology segments, but that is not the case with the rest. In fact, the trade between the US and China has been expanding as well. It is because of the fact that over the last 40 years or so, essentially most developed industrialized countries have made China their workshop because the infrastructure is better. You have skilled labor, which relatively speaking is cheaper than anywhere else in the world. And while those advantages exist, it is difficult to see how the rest of the world can, in fact, just walk away from China. India is talking about how we should position ourselves for, the industry which is leaving China will come to India. Or even if they are not leaving China, they want some degree of risk reduced by having China +1. The fact is, if you look at the figures, hardly any industry is actually leaving China. So that's the reality. So the reason why, even though we may want to limit Chinese economic involvement in India, we have so far not been able to do so. In some key sectors, our own exports are dependent upon components which come from China. So if you take APIs, for example, for our pharmaceuticals, which are a big export industry, or much of our electronics industry, a large number of the components still come from China. So even if there is a decision to try and limit our exposure, economic exposure to China, that will take quite a long period of time. So that's the reality in terms of what we are facing. Secondly, with regard to the question of, what was the first question was about?
The future of India.
Yeah. So this is one part of the future. That if we are really looking at this from a rational point of view, and the point of view of the mutual economic interests of the two sides, then it stands to reason that more is to be gained by a closer economic and trade relationship with China than, for example, by trying to decouple from China. Whether we will go in that direction is a question mark because of the politics. But there are these exceptions that I'm drawing attention to, which may show that maybe both sides are seeing that there is a certain advantage in keeping the political temperature down and moving ahead with this. Will we go in this direction? The test will come when we, for example, host the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in India in May. Because India as host would have invited Xi Jinping, would have invited Putin, would have invited a number of Central Asian heads of state. So if they come and respond to that invitation, that means there is no doubt that the relationship is now going in a more positive direction. The second test will come when in September we have the G20 meeting. Now already in the preparatory meetings for the G20, Chinese participation is quite okay. I mean, they are sending people to these meetings, and very soon we are going to have the foreign ministers meeting, and if they come, that will mean, because they have a new foreign minister, if the new foreign minister comes, maybe we might start moving in a direction of, the political side becoming less salient. Now, that brings me to the last question about Ukraine. So, look at what happened just before the Ukraine war broke out. You had the Beijing Olympics, and you had Putin come to Beijing, and they signed what is a historically unprecedented document, joint statement, in which they talked about how China and Russia were going to establish a no-limits partnership, and there was no domain which was excluded from the two sides being able to work together. So that's really a very sweeping kind of a commitment to a stronger relationship. What is the backdrop to this? The backdrop to this is that, one, for some time now, because of what I mentioned earlier, since the economic and financial crisis. The sense in China has been that we are shrinking this gap with the United States of America. We may even very soon become the #1 economic power in the world. Therefore, an opportunity is opening up for China to move, as Xi Jinping said, to the center of the world stage. That is, what you have today as the West-dominated international order, why should we live by the rules made by the West when we are actually becoming the dominant power? So this is a moment of strategic opportunity, and we should try to push China towards a much more active international role. Where does Russia figure in this? Russia figures in this because they also have the same perception. Why do they have that perception? Even though the Russians are a declining power in a sense, they are still a very large country, massive resources, nuclear power. So their sense of themselves is that they are still a great power, but it is, relatively speaking, a declining power. But what they have been seeing is, like the Chinese, that the West is declining, especially after the economic and financial crisis. They share the Chinese view that the West is now in such a weak position that this is the time for both China and Russia, if they come together, to actually, in a sense, push the West out of the way. Russia got this sense. Why? Because whatever they did in, say, Georgia some years ago, there was no Western response. Much bigger than that, they took over Crimea, there was no Western response. So their sense was that if we actually do something in Ukraine, there will be no Western response. Not just because the West, according to them, did not have the military capabilities. Of course it has the military capability. But what they said was, the West has now lost its will to fight. Why? And that was clinched by what happened to the US in Afghanistan. They saw all this chaos, the Americans withdrawing, saying, we have had enough, we will never get into this kind of an engagement again. Therefore, even if the United States of America is still the most formidable military power in the world, it doesn't want to fight. So the miscalculation both on the part of Russia as well as China was thinking that if we actually push the envelope, there will not be a response. So that was one. They were surprised that there was actually a response, and the West did come together. Secondly, I think the Russian calculation was, and perhaps bought into by the Chinese, even if they may not have known originally whether this was going to take place, their sense was that this will be over within 4 or 5 days. That was the calculation. Even the Chinese calculation, I don't like this, but this is going to be over very, very soon. Because Russia has such a massive amount of military power, how could Ukraine in fact withstand it? So today you are facing a situation where those calculations have gone wrong. The Chinese response has been very cautious. So even though they don't agree with the sanctions put on Russia by the United States of America, none of those sanctions have been violated by the Chinese. They have been very, very cautious because they know if they violate those sanctions, maybe they would be the target. So generally speaking, what we see today is a stepping back by China. So the wolf warrior diplomacy that we were talking about, making very, very aggressive, in-your-face kind of statements, that was the kind of a diplomacy that the Chinese were involved in. There has been a muting of that. Xi Jinping himself has also stepped back. Of course, that has also been affected by the chaos caused by the COVID policy. So for a variety of reasons, that sense of triumphalism, that sense of, we can sort of just push the West out of the way, that kind of triumphalism has been on the retreat. So maybe that might also be something that then factors in the India-China relationship.
I want to check. China has a policy of, giving loans to weaker countries. You see the example of Sri Lanka. We are seeing something going on in Pakistan and even in African countries. For the matter of fact, even in Europe, Chinese companies are buying big businesses over there. So, just to sum it up, and of course they have these softwares like TikTok and there are other softwares which people are very worried. US itself is kind of now stopping certain softwares because they fear that the Chinese can through the software get into the system and hack the systems. So seeing this, what do you think is Chinese policy? What are they aiming at with all this thing happening? Isn't it going to get the entire world unstable with these kind of things happening?
There are 4 or 5 things mixed up together here. So let's unpack them first. With regard to, say, Chinese loans and credits given under the Belt and Road Initiative, which is several $100 billion which has been deployed. The Chinese development experience has been that if you build infrastructure, development will follow. That is, you build a road, economic activity will be promoted. You build a railway, development will follow. That has been their developmental experience. So what essentially when they are going out, this is what they have in their mind, that actually there can be big returns if you invest in infrastructure which others are not investing in. Developing countries want infrastructure. So if it is not coming from elsewhere and the Chinese are ready to offer, why should they not take it? The problem has been with respect to the choice of projects. So you mentioned Europe. Actually, the Belt and Road Initiative has been the most successful in Europe, where from the Chinese point of view, because the returns are coming. Say Piraeus Port, for example, in Greece. Or they have taken a fairly large, equity stake in the Rotterdam port. Now, these are established businesses, where they are actually able to make money out of it. That's not necessarily the case in many developing countries in Asia or in Africa. So, give you an example. The Maldives. So in Maldives, one of the very popular projects for the Maldivians has been a very fine bridge which has been built between the main island and the island on which the airport is located. So earlier you had to actually take a boat to go anywhere else. But now you have a very fine bridge which has been financed by the Chinese against a loan. But what is the problem? The problem is that in order to pay back that loan, you need to have a level of tariff that no Maldivian can afford. The only people who use it are the people who are the tourists, rich tourists. So you have this very fine infrastructure which has been built, but it can't generate income. What has happened in Sri Lanka? Exactly the same thing. So you have built a lovely port in Hambantota, but there is no business. So you can't pay for it. That is why the Chinese companies took it over. So this is where you have perhaps the kind of, expectations that they may have been, both on the Chinese side as well as on the recipient side, has actually not happened. You take Pakistan. In Pakistan, when you had the China-Pakistan economic corridor which was inaugurated, the Pakistanis said this is going to be a game changer for Pakistan. It would completely transform the Pakistani economy. About 60 to 70% of the credits which were coming into Pakistan under this China-Pakistan economic corridor was for coal-based thermal power plants. Now, a few years ago, Pakistan was suffering from the kind of blackouts which you must have been reading about today. That was the case about 6-7 years ago. China came in with massive amount of capital, mostly Chinese companies or with joint ventures, which were set up in the power structure, in the power sector. About 3 years ago, Pakistan ended up having surplus power. They were even making soundings whether India would buy some of that power. That is how dramatically the situation changed. But what has gone wrong? Each of these power plants which have been set up, the Chinese government or the Chinese company has guaranteed return. So if I have invested $1 billion, minimum guaranteed return to the Chinese is 12%. In some places, it is 20%. How do you pay for that? You can only pay for that if you have a higher tariff. Otherwise, who will buy your electricity? You know, if you buy your electricity at such high rates so as to be able to pay back, nobody will buy your electricity. Now, because of the fact that politically it was difficult for the Pakistani government to allow tariffs to rise, huge amount of debt has been built up. They have not paid the generating companies. So the generating companies are now saying, until you pay us, we will not generate power. So what happens? From a surplus power country, it is today back again to a deficit country. Huge blackouts. So what I'm trying to say is that the principle on which the Chinese operated, judging from their own experience, because it is true that in China you build up infrastructure, development has followed, and how successfully. Or when they have invested in infrastructure in Europe, because these are highly developed economies, again, returns have come. That is not necessarily the case in each and every Asian, African, or Latin American country. In some places, it has worked. It has done quite well. So it is not as if all over the world, there has been this kind of a debt trap. Right. But in many places, there has been a debt trap precisely because of this reason. So we have to be a little nuanced in the way in which we judge what has been happening.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
So with the COVID-19 resurgence, it happened because of the China protests. How is China going to deal with perception in the world? Because at the end of the day, the whole world comes to standstill for a few years because of that whole issue. Now, is the China's economic power is going to get rebalanced with somebody else, or it's going to continue will all forget and move on in life?
So it's the image of China being impacted.
Yes.
By the number of deaths.
Yes. Not in that. Economics of China is considered to be superpower. Now there is a perception issue that the whole world came to a standstill because of this issue. Now is someone thinking in the world that it should be rebalanced for a period of time, because that whole issue is pretty large.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Why don't
okay.
you? So we'll take the second.
Yeah. Ask your question.
Yeah.
My question was, so we talk a lot, I think, about how China sees India. What is your read on how India sees China? The board, the permanent seats of the Security Council, as well as the bilateral.
Yes,
I'd like to have the last question of the evening because we want to give Ambassador Saran the rest after this. So we've been talking a lot about the border conflict in the Himalayas. I just want to point your attention to the whole issue of maritime security. And I just want to get your take on that, because one thing is economically building the ports. But if you look at India, and we've got Sri Lanka, a port in Sri Lanka, we've got Gwadar in Pakistan, and we've got something coming up in Cambodia, Myanmar. As I look at our map, I see these little pop-ups of Chinese ports coming up. Now, they could just be an economic belt and road initiative, but somehow it seems to play into to our future in maritime security, and I'd like to have your take on that. That's the last question for the evening.
Yeah, okay. So as far as the COVID issue is concerned, yes, of course, there has been perhaps, concern all over the world that because of the kind of opaqueness, lack of transparency on the part of China, this infection spread so quickly right across the world. Perhaps if the Chinese had been upfront with this pandemic having erupted in Wuhan and shared this information with the rest of the world, perhaps we would not have faced the kind of situation that we have. Now, the issue is that China itself is facing a huge issue. what was seen as a great success story by China, that look at the chaos in the United States, millions of people dying, look at what has been happening in Europe. There was almost gleeful accounts of what was happening in India, for example, during the second wave, when there were, funeral pyres on the side of the road. They were comparing all this, and particularly in their domestic propaganda, see how successful we have been in managing the pandemic, where the rest of the world has been in complete chaos. Now, the shoe is on the other foot. It is now China, which is, because of suddenly removing the zero COVID policy, it is finding that the infection is raging across China. There will be an impact of that. The problem with the rest of the world is not so much the COVID-19, it is the impact on the global supply chains, where China is a key component of those supply chains. Virtually no major manufacturing anywhere in the world can do without the Chinese, components being there. So what is happening today is that as a result of that, there is an impact on those global supply chains, and that could have, over a period of time, could have a impact. The general sense today is that while China was growing at the rate of 5 to 6% per annum and was on the road to becoming the world's largest economy, it appears that there is consensus opinion that those years of high growth rates are now a thing of the past. That is, China, like any other maturing economy in the world, is now probably going to get to a 2 to 3% annual growth rate over the longer term. If that happens, then of course the whole economic balance of power starts changing. And this will then have an impact in terms of foreign policy as well. But if we are looking at the situation today, at this slice of time, the world is unable to do without China. So for many years, Chinese growth has been responsible for something like 30% to 35% of global growth. So if that particular impetus to global growth is now diminished, then you are probably looking at a global growth rate of not more than 3% to 4% per annum. India has the potential to make up some of that because of the very size of its economy. But that means you have to take, policy positions, you have to change your economic strategy if you want to get to that point. This is a moment of opportunity for India in that sense, because there is no other economy in the world which has the scale which India can offer, which has the kind of size of market which India can offer. So potentially these are huge advantages. But whether we actually translate them into actual gains for us, that remains a question mark. And on the maritime side, the last question, of course, one of the, shall I say, strong points of India has been that it is a strong naval power, in the sense that it has a footprint which goes across the whole Indian Ocean, the western reaches, Gulf, eastern reaches, right up to South China Sea, and it is expanding. The problem with us is that we are a naval power, but we are not a maritime power. So this distinction is very important. Why? Because China is not just a naval power. It is the #1 shipbuilding country today in the world. If you are looking at, say, 15 of the largest container ports in terms of volume handled, 12 of those are Chinese. Shanghai is the largest container port in the world and one of the most efficient, let me add. So whether it is in terms of shipping, in terms of port handling capability, in terms of how much of cargo is carried by Chinese registered ships, in all those metrics, China is not just a naval power, but it is a important maritime power. The problem with India is that we are naval power, yes, quite right, but we are not a maritime power. So even today, much of our external trade is not carried in Indian ships. It is carried in foreign ships. Secondly, our ports are still not capable of handling all our cargo. So that is the reason why Colombo port, for example, is so important, because most of Indian cargo is transshipped through Colombo, transshipped through Dubai, transshipped through Singapore. So today when we are talking about, say, buying oil from Russia, now if they have to be carried in ships which are non-Russian or non-Indian, then it is almost impossible to get insurance for those shipments. So we are facing that kind of a problem, because we simply do not have that kind of capability. So what I'm trying to say is that actually in terms of naval power, we are better off, but in terms of maritime power, we are still very far behind. And in today's world, you cannot make a separation, It is countries which are great maritime powers which will also be great naval powers. So that asymmetry that we have needs to be addressed. The other aspect, of course, is, yes, because when you have resources, you are able to build more ships. If you have resources, then you are able to invest in more ports, which is precisely what the Chinese are doing. And the distinction whether this is for commercial purposes or for strategic purposes is to my mind, is a very irrelevant kind of division. Because when you have major assets which you have acquired abroad, you will naturally want their security to be ensured as well. So if China has built a port, say in Sri Lanka, it will want the ability in order to safeguard those assets which it has built. So we should not say that, oh, this is only for commercial purposes. Nothing is just for commercial purposes. Nothing is just for military purposes. The manner in which we have to deal with this is precisely what we are trying to do. While we try to build up our naval assets, while we try to address the kind of weaknesses that we have on the maritime side, you need to partner with others. Because you are not, by yourself, you are not capable of dealing with this challenge. So what do? You do Quad. You work together with the US, you work together with Japan, you work together with Australia. All the powers who are as worried as you are about the assertion of, unilateral assertion of power by China are ready to work together in order to have some constraint on Chinese ability to penetrate in these regions, which is precisely what we are trying to do. But the long term is precisely whether or not you are able to develop your own capabilities. Nobody is going to come and fight your battles for you. Yeah.
Does that answer what India thinks of China question as well?
Yeah, China is the most important challenge, most significant challenge that India is facing. Yeah, has to try and deal with it.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you agree that this has been a master class by Shyam Saran. A big hand for him.
Please, big hand for everybody.